Good evening, everybody. And I apologize, a little bit of technical difficulties there, but with no further ado, we are going to get rolling. Welcome, everybody, to the Jewish Destiny series, the Jerry and Carol Harris Jewish Destiny series. Tonight, we are continuing our discussion of the Kings. We are going to do the final judgment. In other words, finish up the Book of Kings and finish up that story and start to make our way into the books of, or at least the story of the Kings of Israel. Like I said Kings a moment ago. We're finishing up the Book of Judges, and that'll transition us into the Book of Samuel, which will take us to the Book of Kings and cover the whole time period of the First Commonwealth of Israel. For those of you who would like to follow along with the outline, I'm going to put it in the chat box right now, just momentarily. Give me one moment, which is why I said momentarily. There's the link, and it's coming through your chat box right now. So that is our outline for anyone who'd like to follow the outline. And 1 second here. Sorry, my computer's misbehaving a little bit. There we go. Okay, and just before we start here, I had the flyer up here before we began. I want to show one more time that we have a very special Tisha B'Av program on Sunday. Sunday is in fact Tisha B'Av, which is why we're having a Tisha B'Av program. It's going to be in conjunction with Torah Anytime. The program is called Torah Anyone, an inspirational Tisha B'Av experience for any Jew, any level, any time. And we're featuring an amazing list of Jewish speakers there. I somehow got my name on there with many other great ones. There's a few Cleveland personalities there, Rabbi Tannenbaum, Rabbi Ben Shushan, and many, many, many amazing personalities. So be sure to check that out. That'll be all day on Tisha B'Av, Sunday, starting at 10 a.m., going through till the end of the fast. So a great way to get some inspiration and appreciate what the day is all about. Okay, with no further ado, we will jump now into our history series. So welcome, everybody, and let's dive right in. So we ended last week with talking about the first 10 or so of the judges, getting up to Yiftach, who was sort of in many ways a great leader, in many ways a terrible leader, definitely had a very enigmatic ending to his career and on his legacy. And now we enter into a discussion about quite possibly the most famous of the Shoftim, and that is none other than a man referred to in the book of Shoftim, the book of Judges, as Ivsan. But like with many people in Tanakh, there are multiple names, all to connote different ideas. And the name that we really know him by, his more famous name, is Boaz. And so the Navi, the book of the prophets, does an interesting thing here, that in the book of Judges, it makes 1, 2, 3 lines, if you will, about Ivsan. Our sages tell us Ivsan was Boaz, as if to tell us that now we have to have a scene change to where we focus on our story of the Jewish people. And that is the book of Ruth, because the book of Ruth is where we have the real story of Ivsan/Boaz. And we really can come to understand who he was and how great he was and what kind of integral role he played to the formation of the Jewish people. So we're told that Ivsan had a total of 61 children in total. And when we meet him, he is already an old man. He's already seemingly a senior citizen. We're really only introduced to him about, a few weeks, maybe a few months before he actually passes away. And he comes to us at a very enigmatic time, as is most of the days of the judges for the Jewish people in Israel. There's actually a famine in the land of Israel, we are told. And there is a great family who are the leaders of the Jewish people, and is the family of none other than Nachshon ben Aminadav. Now, Nachshon ben Aminadav is the famous leader of the Jewish people, who was the first one to jump into the Yam Suf, the first one to jump into the sea, and it has been his descendants who have continuously led the tribe of Judah. And we'll see in a moment that it will also be his descendants that will be the kings of Israel, because David is one of his descendants. So just to get the family tree, we have Nachshon ben Aminadav, who had a number of children that were told, and his children are the names of Avimelech, Salmon, Ploni Almoni, and Naomi's father. We don't know Naomi's father. Those are seemingly his 4 sons, Nachshon's 4 sons, and maybe there's a generation in between. But then we have that Salmon has his son Boaz. And so we basically have at this point one big happy family. So we'll introduce all of our characters. Our characters are, again, introduced Ibzan/Boaz already. We have his uncle Avimelech, who we're going to be focusing on. We have his first cousin Naomi, who we're going to be focusing on. And Naomi marries her uncle Avimelech, which we know is very common, not very common in the Torah, but it happened a number of times in the Torah. It definitely happens a number of times in the prophets. And this is one famous time where it happens. Okay, so we're going to focus now on the family of Avimelech. So now Avimelech, we're told by our sages, was a great man, was a tremendous individual. And he could have just as easily been the shofet as Ibzan, as Boaz, his brother, or his nephew. Now, we're going to see that he makes seemingly a bad decision here, because when the famine hits Israel, what does he do? He ups and goes to Moab. Now, if you remember the map we gave last week, Moab is an area to the southeast of Israel, and that is where he goes to hang out during the famine. Now, there's a big question mark as to why he goes in the first place, and there's an even bigger problem with the fact that he went there. Our sages tell us that the reason that he went there in the first place is because not only was he a great man, but he was a very wealthy man. And essentially, he made a ill-fated decision that he didn't want all the schnoors, he didn't want all the people asking for tzedakah, asking for handouts to bother him during the famine. So he decides to put some daylight between him and the Jewish people and goes and takes up residency in the land of Moab. Now, that was a problem in and of itself that our sages say because of this, he's going to lose his 2 sons and lose his own life. They're all going to pass away within a short period of time. Now, there's sort of a more colloquial problem, and that is that if we look in the Torah tells us that there are several nations that become, so to speak, demonized, that become ill-fated nations in the great destiny of the Jewish people. And while anyone at any point can convert to be a Jew, there are certain national heritages that make the life of a Jew quite different. It's quite difficult. So, for example, you can have an Egyptian, a descendant of Pharaoh and those Egyptians, you can have such a person convert to be a Jew, but they have a status of not being able to marry into the Jewish people for 4 generations. Now, what that means is, again, nowadays we don't know ancient lineage so well, but if we had someone who was had the ancient lineage of the house of Pharaoh, of the ancient empire of Egypt, and they converted to Judaism, so they would not be allowed to marry a full-blown Jew, or at least a Jew of pure pedigree, for 4 generations. That would mean that their children, their grandchildren, and their great-grandchildren could not marry another Jew, and therefore, and now they could live as a Jew and definitely be full-blown Jew, count them for minyan, give them an aliyah, give them a bar mitzvah, do whatever, but they cannot marry another Jew. Now, the question is, who do they marry? Well, they can marry other people like themselves. In other words, they can marry another, like, let's say a first-generation Jewish Egyptian or Egyptian Jew, not sure how that goes, could marry another first-generation Egyptian Jew. A second-generation Egyptian Jew can marry a second-generation Egyptian Jew, and so forth and so on. So it's not until you get to both parents being the father, we're going to see in a moment goes by the father, it's not until the father gets 4 generations down that you have, so to speak, that tinge taken off their record, or that issue taken off their record, and then they can marry any Jew they want. That's Egypt, right? The Moabites, who we met a few weeks ago in the Torah, have a much more stringent situation than the Egyptians, and that's because the Moabites are looked at. Sorry, we met them just. I guess we finished them off last week, so to speak. They were mentioned in the past 3 parshios. The Moabites are the evil nation that attacks the Jewish people unprovoked with the evil prophet Bilam. By the way, if you want more information about this, I'll give you a sneak peek. This is what my Tisha B'Av talk is going to focus on. So the kingdom of Moab is looked at as a terrible, terrible, terrible nation because they provoke a war with the Jewish people, totally unprovoked. They try and wipe the Jewish people out. They seduce the Jewish people. It leads to the death of tens of thousands of Jews, looked at as terrible people. And therefore, we say that their national traits, so to speak, their national midos are such that we don't want that mixing into the Jewish people. We just don't want it. Now, again, they can still convert to be Jews, but our sages tell us, lo yavu b'kal Yisrael, which means that even though they can convert to be a Jew, they can never marry a Jew of pure pedigree, meaning that if a Moabite converts to be a Jew, they can only marry other Moabite converts and can never, ever marry a full-blown Jew. No matter how many generations you go down, once you have Moabite blood, you cannot marry into a Jew of pure pedigree. Now, so that, therefore, is going to raise this unbelievable question that there's just not a great answer for, not a great answer that I've found, is here you have a man that on one hand, our sages say started off great, like Avimelech, and he goes to Moab, and when he is in Moab, he takes wives for his daughters. I'm sorry, he takes wives for his sons. And the question mark over here is, well, how did he do that? You can't marry a Moabite. As I mentioned before, the decree on any of these nations, whether it's the Moabites, the Egyptians, etc., it is on the male descendants. It is not on the female descendants. We're going to see there was a time period in history where it was unclear, but definitely the final halacha, if you will, the law today, is that this is something that only falls onto the male descendants, not onto the female descendants. So therefore, Avimelech, who, even though it was, I think, still maybe somewhat of a halachic question in his time, he felt that the prohibition to marry Moabites was only on males. His sons were Jews, nice Jewish boys, and therefore he can marry them off to Moabite females without a problem. Okay, so that's how we sort of answered the halachic problem, but we still have the sort of hashkafic, the philosophical problem of why didn't he stay in Israel, help out the Jews? What in the world was he doing marrying off his sons to Moabites if he was a great man? So the way we can answer that is to look at who his wives were. Who his daughter-in-laws were. The daughter-in-laws of Avimelech, in other words, his sons' wives, were none other than Rus and Orpah, or Ruth and Orpah. Now, who are Ruth and Orpah, besides his daughter-in-laws? Our sages tell us that they were probably the granddaughters or great-granddaughters of none other than Eglon. Now, who is Eglon? I'm sure you all memorized the class from last week, and you know that Eglon was the Moabite king, the first Moabite king we see to challenge the Jewish people in the time period of the Judges. He has his great showdown with Ehud ben Gera. We mentioned he's a very fat man. Ehud ben Gera does a sneak attack with the sword, sticks it in, kills him. That's Eglon. And we're told that both Ruth and Orpah were sisters, and they were descendants of Eglon. So basically, they weren't just plain old Moabite women, they were Moabite princesses. And let's face it, this is something very common in antiquity. We see that there were royal marriages even on the part of the Jews. When we get to King David, when we get for sure to King Solomon, and on down the line from there, again, after Solomon, it becomes looked down upon in many ways because we see that Solomon doesn't deal with it so right. But we see that such a thing was done. So if we want to try and at some level justify what Avimelech's thinking was, it was a royal marriage. Here, he was the closest thing to royalty as a Jew. He was of this great family. He was of the family of Nachshon ben Aminadav from the house of Yehuda, which was already destined to be the house of the king of Israel. They knew that already. And therefore, it was a political marriage, trying to make peace with the Moabites. That's what Avimelech was trying to do. And that's why he marries off his two sons, Machlon and Kilion, those were the names, to none other than Rus, Ruth, and Orpah. Now, the only problem was, as we said, everything we said so far, right? He was wrong. He was wrong in marrying off his sons to Moabites. He was wrong in going to Moab to begin with. He was wrong in not taking mercy on the Jewish people. And therefore, he dies, his son dies, and his wife, Naomi, beautiful name, one of my most favorite names in Tanakh, maybe second only to Pinchas. So his wife, Naomi, is left a widow. His two daughter-in-laws, Ruth and Orpah are left as widows, and they are not only are they widows, but they are destitute. The fortune that was brought from Israel to Moabite has withered away, both figuratively, spiritually, and in all ways. Obviously, since Ruth and Orpah have joined the house of Nachshon, they're no longer privileged to the wealth of their father, of Eglon, or their grandfather, the royal Moabite house. And therefore, Naomi, on her trip back to Israel, she encourages Ruth and Orpah to stay put in Moab, to go back to their father's house, to reclaim their role as Moabite princesses, and to not starve with her in Israel. And we can ask a bunch of questions at this point. Number one, this is obviously after the Torah was given. The Torah already applies in the books of prophets and whatnot. What in the world was Naomi thinking sending her daughter-in-laws back to Moab, right? I mean, for crying out loud, weren't they Jewish at this point? Well, I don't know. Were they Jewish? I mean, when did they convert? Which is the big question over here, because here you have, again, this great family that our sages laud upon. And Avimelech, who, even though he was wrong, his intentions were right. Would he just go and marry off his sons to non-Jewish Moabite princesses? No, he said it was a political marriage. Therefore, they have to convert. And this comes up time and time again. This is a general framework for this time period. We're going to see it apply very much with Solomon and his multiple wives, his 1,000 wives. And that is that while we have these political marriages that are ultimately looked down upon, of course, all of these men convert their wives before they actually marry them. Because if not, we would have big questions on the lineage of the Jewish people, because we would have questions on the kingship, on if there are Jewish mothers that led to Jewish kings, etc. We'll see there's going to be a lot of these questions. So we have to say that all of them definitely converted before they married. In this case, Machlon and Kilion, later on with Solomon, they definitely converted. But we're going to see the Talmud explains it's a interesting kind of convert. Why? Because in Jewish law, we take conversion very seriously. Conversion laws are very strict, and we always look for ulterior motives in conversion. So therefore, one of the old party lines, and it's 100% true, is in Judaism, you can't convert for marriage. If someone would go to a Jewish court and want to convert, and the reason for converting is because their spouse or the soon-to-be spouse is Jewish, and their parents aren't going to let them get married unless she converts, unless he converts, technically in Jewish law, that's a problem. Now, even though it's a problem, what happens if a Jewish court lets it happen, right? In other words, definitely the Talmud says clearly, Jewish law says clearly, you can't convert for ulterior motives, you can't convert for marriage, you can't convert for wealth. And not only that, but at time periods in Jewish history, when, so to speak, the Jews are on top, the Talmud tells us we can't accept converts. Right? Because it's one thing to convert to Judaism when, they're blasting you on CNN and social media or in political campaigns going on in Ohio. But it's another thing when you're on top, when you have King Solomon in the temple and all the wealth. How do you convert then? So the Talmud says you can't convert then because everyone wants to be a Jew then. But what happens if people convert? Because we see that there's exceptions to the system, or people slip through the cracks, or whatever it is. So the Talmud says like this. Such a person becomes, and we're going to talk about this a lot over the next few sessions, a Jew on probation. In other words, they are basically Jewish. They can go ahead and remain married or marry their Jewish spouse, and they're treated as a Jew, but it's almost like there's an undefined probation period that if they ever lapse back into idol worship, into their previous religion, etc., their conversion is, so to speak, null and void, or it's retroactively no good. And we're going to see this is the case with Ruth and Orpah, that of course Ruth and Orpah converted before marrying Machlon and Kilion. Question how that happened, but at least there was a conversion there. But because Machlon and Kilion were a royal family, and it could say it's been done for wealth or been done for marriage or all these things we just defined, therefore it's on condition. Right? On condition that they remain sincere Jews. This concept is talked about in the prohibition. The probation period is never explained, but it's talked about. Therefore, Naomi, now when Machlon is gone, Kilion's gone, Avimelech's gone, it's just her and her two daughter-in-laws. Naomi says, go back, guys. You have an out here because you have this prohibition this probation period. And I'm from the South, so think a lot about prohibition. I don't know, what can I say? You have this probation period, and therefore, take advantage of it. Don't become I'm going to be a pauper back in Israel. I'm disgraced. My husband left. He shouldn't have left. And I'm going to be a pauper there, just like I'm a pauper there. Stay here in the land of Moab. And he encourages both her daughter-in-laws to do it. And initially they both say, no, we're staying with you. And eventually Ruth says, your God is my God, your people are my people, your land is my land, this land is your land, this land is my land, from California to New York Island, whatever it is. She makes that fateful statement, and Orpah, in the end, gives up. Now, we have to understand that at a certain level, Ruth and Orpah were great women. To have made as far as they did, to be accepted as Jewish princesses. It's not easy to become a Jap, let's face it, or a Jamup at this point, Jewish Moabite princess. Not easy, but they start off great. But we see that Ruth makes it, so to speak, and Orpah doesn't. So what happens to Orpah? Our sages tell us that the night that she left Naomi, it wasn't like she just eased back into the palace of the Moabites. It wasn't like she, said it was nice to be a Jew. So, I'll keep some customs. I'll still sing Shabbos Miros. And, I love matzo ball soup and I love borscht. So I'm going to keep some nice Jewish customs. No, our sages tell us that she snapped like a rubber band that night. In other words, the pressure was building to be able to stick with Naomi. And she was trying and trying and trying. And then the last minute she snaps. And what happens when you let go of that rubber band with pressure? It doesn't stop here. It goes boom, flying in the opposite direction. And that's what we see happen to Orpah. And that night that she leaves Naomi, she engages in a whole list of immoral behaviors, both with humans and with animals. And we're told that night she conceives a man by the name of Goliath is his Hebrew name, and Goliath is his English name. And we're going to see next week, maybe the week after, that he has a great showdown with his first cousin, or maybe first cousin once removed, King David. Now, it's interesting because we're going to see that when Goliath and and David fight, what is David's one weapon they takes a slingshot, which I think is very symbolic because that's almost like what Orpah was. She was a slingshot where she, you pull her back and pressure, and boom, and then she went flying in the other direction. But beyond that, we see that Goliath, when David comes to him with just the slingshot and the rock, he says, like, what am I, a dog that you come at me with these weapons? And our sages say that he was alluding to the fact that quite possibly his lineage was actually a dog because of his mother's behavior on the night that he was conceived. So that's what happens with Orpah. But Ruth sticks with Naomi through and through. She goes back to the land of Israel, goes back to that great Jewish town of Beis Lechem, aka Bethlehem, which is home of that very, very, very world famous Jew, King David. Bet you thought I was talking about someone else, right? Bethlehem is where the seat of Judah is. That's by the way, that's why the other religion claims their king or savior, whatever they call him, comes from Bethlehem, because that's the town of Judah, of King David. And anyway, so Naomi goes back there with her daughter-in-law Ruth, who's fully committed to be a Jew, past her probation period, and they're living as paupers. So as they're living as paupers, they are relying on the community fund, so to speak. They're going to the food bank, which in times of antiquity and in agrarian society was something we called lekach, shichach, and peah, that farmers had an obligation to leave behind a certain amount of their crop, anything that was dropped, anything that was forgotten, anything, the corners of the field, etc. And Ruth and Naomi are collecting these handouts, these alms, if you will, to the poor to be able to survive. In the process of collecting these alms, they end up collecting them from the field of none other than Ivsan/Boaz. And at the time, Boaz takes notice of Naomi. And he says, who is that young lady? Now, this is a general rule we're going to have to keep in mind anytime we're messing with, or not really messing with, but defining the lineage of King David and the lineage of the Messiah. We already started off a couple of sessions ago when we talked about Moab in general, Lot and his daughters, right? We're talking about this nation of Moab we've been talking about tonight. That's the descendants of Lot and his daughters. In other words, Lot had the ancestral relationship with his daughter. They had a child named Moab from father. That's what it's called. And that is this nation we're talking about. And that's the nation that Ruth comes from. And she is now within the Jewish people. So that's the entrance of Lot's seed, so to speak, back into the Jewish people. And so he takes notice of this girl. And by the way, in all these situations where like I said, we're painting the picture of the Messiah, it's always big question marks. First of all, the storyline always gives us a slew of question marks. But beyond that, you're going to have like tremendous age differences. Like if you remember, we talked about Yehuda and Tamar, Judah and Tamar. Tremendous age difference between Judah and Tamar. Right now, Boaz and Ruth, tremendous age difference. When we fast forward in a couple sessions and we talk about David and Bathsheba, tremendous age difference. Because one of the rules we said then, and I'll remind you of it now, is whenever we're talking about the lineage of Mashiach, the messianic lineage, sometimes the Almighty just has to take over and make seemingly unbelievable things happen to make sure that there are unions that need to happen in order for the Messiah one day to be born. And that's what happens here. You have the old man Boaz, the young convert Ruth, and Boaz takes notice. Right? Our sages say the angels made him take notice of Ruth. Naomi notices that Boaz is taking notice of her daughter-in-law and says, oh, maybe we have some hope here. Now, at this point, we have a mitzvah in the Torah called Yibum. Now, Yibum is one of those great mitzvahs in the Torah that has no English translation. In other words, it's often translated by the word levirate marriage, or the phrase levirate marriage, which nobody knows what that means except for Julie, who once looked it up for me. But levirate marriage means brother marriage, and I think Latin, if I remember correctly, what she told me. But no one uses that term levirate unless they're trying to translate yibum. So, like, back to Rabbi Landis' good old rule that whenever we have a Hebrew word where the English translation makes no sense, we're going to stick to the Hebrew, okay? I assume no one but Julie knows what levirate marriage means, so we're just going to call it Yibum. Yibum is a mitzvah in the Torah that if a lady is widowed without any children, she has right of first refusal to the family, usually to the next of kin, usually to a brother, before she chooses, so to speak, to leave the family and go find another family. So that is called Yibum, that marriage that would take place either between a brother or a next of kin. That's Yibum. If she so chooses to not want to be part of the family, or if the next of kin chooses that they don't want her any longer to be part of the family, that's called chalitza, the unshoeing ceremony, because as defined by the Torah, it's a whole process of unshoeing and spitting. It's really, really quite pleasant. And that's what happens. But anyways, seeing as there's next of kin, there's family of her husband, of Kilyom, and the family of Avimelech. Naomi, the mother, starts to think, maybe we can make a Yibum Shidduch here. And she says, let's see if we can get Boaz to take notice of you. So she comes up with a plan, with a scheme to try and get Boaz to take notice. She tells, I mean, it's just a crazy story. Again, Boaz is an old man. Naomi is a young lady. Ruth is a young lady. So Naomi tells Ruth to sneak into Boaz's house at night and to lay down at the foot of his bed and to uncover his feet. Now, I've never gotten deep into the symbolism of that. Maybe that was considered a provocative thing back in their times. I don't know. But be it as it may, that's what happens. Needless to say, this startles the old man Boaz. He says, "Who's there? What's going on?" She says, "It's me, Ruth, daughter-in-law of Naomi, your kin." And he says, "Oh." Now, right then, we say is where the divine idea, so to speak, kicks in that, well, maybe I'm supposed to, and, he starts thinking, but he says, 1 second, we have an issue here. Yibum can only be performed with the next of kin. There's somebody who's more closely related to you than me, and the book of Ruth tells us his name is Ploni Almoni, which means John Doe in Hebrew, right? It's like a name that means John so-and-so. And that's because we actually know his name. Our sages tell us his name is Tov, but because he's not willing to participate in the building of the house of Israel at this point, he's just called so-and-so over here. Says Boaz, so-and-so is closer in kin than I am, so we have to make sure that he gives the right over to me. And our sages tell us that night he fought every inclination he had, and nothing happens with Rus. The next day he meets with so-and-so, with Ploni Almoni. He buys every right to the estate of Avimelech and Machlon and Kilion, and therefore at that point becomes, so to speak, next of kin, and he can perform Yibum, levirate marriage with Ruth. He does so. That night she conceives with a baby that's name is Oved. Oved is the father of Yishai, Jesse, and Jesse is the father of David, King David. That night, Boaz passes away, as if to say that he fulfilled his purpose in life with passing on his royal seed through Ruth, down to Oved, down to Yishai, and eventually to King David, and eventually the messianic line is built at that point. And again, we see that we're just adding up the stories, the soap opera type stories of the lineage of Messiah. Again, just we painted so far. We started Lot and his daughters. That's the first one we have, the ancestral relationship of Lot and his daughters that makes the nation of the Moabites, right? Then within the Jewish people, we have the story of Yehuda and Tamar, where Tamar, the daughter-in-law, dresses up as a prostitute. They have Peretz. And we're going to see that Peretz is the father of Aminadav, who's the father of Nachshon, who's the father of Boaz, who's the father of Oved, etc., and to our line we have now. And we're going to see that it only gets more murky as we go on, building up that idea that we've said numerous times and quoted numerous times already tonight, that when we talk about the family of Messiah, quite often the Almighty has to kick in. Quite often it's quite questionable, and there's a lot of lessons we can take from it. My favorite lesson is the fact that in the Jewish people, even though we see there's an aristocratic element to the kingship of the Jewish people, that it has to be within the tribe of Judah. It has to be with the family of Nachshon because he was the first one to jump into the sea. We see that there's many descendants, and it's only going to be the most fitting of those descendants who are going to be able to promulgate the house of David. And we see that the most unlikely of people, this Moabite princess, can very much play a role over here because Judaism is a meritocracy, not an aristocracy. Okay, let's pause for questions at this point. I see there's a few in the chat box here, and everyone else can feel free to unmute themselves. Just take a look over here. Right, Ezra. So Dan asked a question that we'll get to in several weeks from now about Ezra sending foreign wives away. Again, in the time of Ezra, they were full-blown foreign wives. In other words, we're talking now about women who convert for marriage and what that status is. In time of Ezra, those are full-blown non-Jewish wives going on over there. And we'll get to how crazy that is. Was Ehud a contemporary of Avimelech? Again, a lot of times when we talk about years, it gets confusing. Like who's limited to the 120, who wasn't limited to the 120. A lot of times in Tanakh, we refer to someone as a father, and father in Tanakh language can really just mean the father line. It can mean a grandfather, great-grandfather. So it's unclear exactly if Ruth and Orpah were daughters actually of Eglon or granddaughters or whatever it was. So the Jews at Sinai, then again at Purim to some regard, right? Did they have to, exactly, like we at Sinai had to accept Judaism. It's a Nasav Nishma. Purim, we had to re-accept Judaism 100%. That's what the convert, that's part of conversion. They have to, the convert has to accept the Torah. And if there's any question that it's ulterior motives, that's when the conversion goes into this probation period that we've talked about tonight, and then we'll talk about again in coming weeks. Okay, any other questions before we continue? Okay, we will continue. So that's, now we have the family of David, so to speak, solidified. We've brought in what we needed to from the house of Abraham, right? We talked about that many sessions ago. We brought in the last little piece of the family of Abraham through Lot and his daughters, Moabites, Ruth, now into the Jewish people. And we have what will eventually be the house of David. Now, after Boaz / Ivsan, we have two of our, I think it's a total of four of these Shoftim that we know nothing about. Elyon HaZvuluni, Elon HaZvuluni, who's from the tribe of Zvulun, and Avdon ben Hillel, told almost nothing about them by the book of Judges and by our sages, told almost nothing. And then we get to our final judge mentioned in the book of Judges. We're going to have two of them mentioned in the book of Samuel, but we get to the final judge mentioned in the book of Judges, and that is none other than the great Shimshon a Gibor, Samson, the great Samson. Now, Samson is, we know the stories of him, his great strength. He's definitely one of the most famous of the Shvatim, of the judges. And if he wasn't famous from biblical times, he's famous from the Grateful Dead, from the song Samson and Delilah. And but he is. We're going to see why he is so famous and why his memory is so etched on the hearts of the Jewish people. Not the least of which is he's one of the Shoftim that's given a lot of press in the book of Shoftim, and we'll see why in a moment. So Shimshon's parents, we know his father's name, Manoach, and we don't know his mother's name. They are barren. They cannot have children. So they go to talk to the high priest. Now, the high priest at this point is Eli HaKohen, not Eli, but Eli with an ayin in Hebrew. Eli HaKohen, he's the high priest. He's the son of Pinchas, the grandson. He's the nephew of Pinchas, or great nephew of Pinchas. And he's the one who takes over as high priest after Pinchas, which we talked about last week when Pinchas's career comes to an enigmatic ending. So Manoach and his wife go to ask Eli, the high priest, to daven on their behalf that they should have a child, and then a miracle is performed. An angel shows up, tells them they're going to have a child, and that they're very, very happy and very ecstatic. And the angel tells them that this child is going to have to be what we call a Nazir La'olam, a Nazirite forever. Now, the Torah talks about this concept of a Nazirite. Nazirite is a person who takes on a certain level of piety, that they choose not to come in contact with the dead, not to drink wine or grape products, not to cut their hair, to try and achieve higher levels of piety. Now, this is never recommended in the Torah. As a matter of fact, when a person ends their term as a Nazirite, they actually have to bring a sin offering, because they essentially prohibited on themselves things that the Torah says they can enjoy. And that's in general, we talk about Nazirus. Now, a plain old Nazirite in the Torah, the term is for 30 days. In other words, if somebody was to take on the Nazirite vow in the Torah, it's a 30-day vow. So it's not so tough. 30 days not drinking wine, 30 days not cutting their hair. Most people don't cut their hair for 30 days anyways, unless you're Bill Clinton, who used to go for a haircut every single day. But hey, when you're the president, why not? Taxpayers are paying for it. So they can't take a haircut, can't drink wine, but it's for 30 days. And then after 30 days, they bring a sacrifice to the temple, and their vow is annulled. Now, Shimshon institutes a new type of Nazirus called Nazir La'olam, called an eternal Nazir, which we refer to in the Talmud based on its first person to enact it. We call it Nazirus Shimshon, the Nazirite of Samson. So in other words, anytime you have a person who becomes an eternal Nazirite, we call them a Samsonite, right? And later on, those people made great luggage pieces, and because they last forever, that's where it comes from. But that's what the idea of being a Samsonite Nazirite means. You're an eternal Nazirite. And Manoach is told by the angel of God that his son has to be this eternal Nazir. Fine. That's what Samson does. He's this eternal Nazir, and he's from a strong age. He's kind of an interesting character, because in one sense, our sages tell us he was lame in both of his legs. In other words, he couldn't walk right in either one of his legs. So here again, we have a heroine who has a physical ailment, right? We had Moshe, who was Kaved Peh, who couldn't talk well. We had Ehud ben Gera, who had a crippled left hand, crippled right hand, and now we have Shimshon, who has crippled legs. But it was quite often with people who are crippled, what he doesn't have in leg strength, he makes up in upper body strength and becomes a fierce warrior through his upper body strength. And he decides that he's going to avenge the Jewish people of their then foe, the Philistines. Anytime we mention the Philistines, we have to remind you the Philistines don't exist anymore, right? Philistines died out a long time ago. 2,500 years ago, there's not been a Philistine on the planet for 2,500 years. The modern day Palestinians have no connection whatsoever to the Philistines, the ancient Philistines, other than when the Romans wanted to de-Judaize the land of Israel after the destruction of the Second Temple. which are going to mourn on Tisha B'Av on Sunday, they gave the country the name of the last known inhabitants before the Jewish people, the Philistines. Hence the name Philistia or Palestine, which stood then for 1900 years until 1948 when it was changed back to Israel. It's always important to point out the modern day Palestinians, no connection whatsoever to the Philistines, right? Because if we don't remind ourselves of that, other people will try and tell us that we're not right. So the torment of the Jewish people this time is the Philistines, and Shimshon, the great Samson, decides he's going to infiltrate the Philistines. He's going to try to take them down from within, and we see that he marries over the course of his life a number of Philistine women, and each time tries to use the inner circle of the Philistines to take down the Philistines. And we see that he's successful in many different times in killing tens of hundreds of thousands of Philistines. And eventually his first wife runs away, or he sends her away. And then he marries a woman by the name of none other than Delilah, or as the Grateful Dead pronounced it, Delilah. Now, something interesting happens with Delilah, because we see that Shimshon, Samson, is regarded as a great person in Jewish history. We can always tell how we remember a person as to whether or not we name for them. And yes, in fact, we do name our children Shimshon. We name our children for Samson, a very close friend from Atlanta, Shimshon Kaplan. And he's like 6'7" and extremely strong. So it's a very fitting name. And but that's we always we name for him. So it must be he's righteous, right? And our sages say he's righteous. And so to speak, his concept of wanting to infiltrate the Philistines from within, our sages seem to be okay with that. But we see at a certain level with his relationship with Delilah, it becomes, maybe not as we would say as L'Shem Shemayim, as for the sake of heaven, as it starts. And Delilah is constantly trying to find the source of his strength. And eventually she's able to get it out from him. Our sages tell us that she, or at least some of the commentaries tell us that she basically, after she tried a number of times, she said, "What's the source of your strength?" Samson misled her one time, two times, a couple of times. Eventually she says, "Okay, hubby, I'm not going to sleep with you till you tell me what the secret to your strength is." And eventually, the male drive overcame him. He gave out his secret, that it was his hair. So sure enough, in his sleep, she cuts off his hair. And the next day, the Philistines come to arrest him, and she ties him up, and they come to arrest him, and he can't do anything. And he's taken as a prisoner. His eyes are gouged out. He's tied to the threshing wheel, and that is how he has to live out the rest of his life. But there's always a big but, that in the end, Shimshon has his final revenge, the just desserts on the Philistines. And that is that he realizes that he did wrong, that he lost his way, that he got deluded by his wife and what he's trying to do with infiltrating the Philistines. The opposite happened. They infiltrated him, and he davens and prays that his strength should be restored for one last valiant act. And what the Philistines don't realize is that once his hair grows back, that's a sign that he's got his strength back, but he doesn't reveal it. And he stays as a slave, as a prisoner, till the right moment, when there's one day when it's a great holiday to the Philistines' god of choice, which is called Dagon. And he's taken to the temple at Dagon, and he asked the servant who is bringing him to the temple, because he's blind at this point, and remember, he's limping his legs, and they think he's weak in the upper body now as well. He says, "Please put me next to some pillars so I can hold myself up. I can barely stand." One of the ways we know he was limp. And he's able to get his hands on two of the main pillars of the temple. And at the fateful moment, when as many of the Philistines as possible, our sages tell us tens of thousands of Philistines were in that temple on that day, he says the fateful words which have rang throughout Jewish history from this point forward, "Tamos nafshi im hapelishtim," which means my soul should die with the Philistines. And he shows that he still has the strength, that his strength has come back. He rips down the two supporting pillars. The temple of Dagon comes crashing to the crashing down to the ground with tens of thousands of Philistines inside, taking Samson's life, taking the life of the aristocracy of the Philistines, taking the life of so many of the Philistines, and avenging the tormentors of the Jewish people, bringing peace to the Jewish people. And that's one of the reasons I believe why Shimshon is revered with such glory, because of that lesson that all too often Jews have had to put into play, that concept of Talmus nafshi im haplishtim, that my soul should die with the Philistines. And we're going to see it time and time again with Esther and Mordechai and Ezra and Nehemiah and the Maccabees. And so often we're going to have these Jews who had to infiltrate into the non-Jewish surroundings to be able to take down our enemies from within, saying that I'm going to give over myself, the ultimate we call Mesiris Nefesh, the giving over of ourselves to the Almighty, saying that the role of a Jew in this world is to sanctify heaven. And if me doing this valiant act to bring down the enemies of the Jewish people is what's going to save the Jewish people, then Talmus Nashi Ima Plishtim, I'm willing to do such a thing. And on Sunday, we're going to be observing Tisha B'Av. And this is, in many ways, what we're remembering on Tisha B'Av. We're remembering all of the tragedies throughout Jewish history and how in every generation there were those great Jews who said, Talmus Nashi Ima Plishtim, I'm going to stick with the Jewish people no matter what, even if they kill me, but my soul will die with them. And that's why we see throughout Jewish history that the great ending to any great nation is to start up with the Jewish people. If you want to know where a world power will end its career as a world power, that is when they start up with the Jewish people. I mean, just look at the ancient Egyptians, that great empire, gone after starting up with the Jewish people. Babylonians, gone. Romans, gone. Right? We fast forward throughout history. The Crusaders, gone. The Cossacks, gone. The Nazis, Yimach Shemam, gone. Because you might start up with the Jewish people, but once you do, Talmus Nafshi Ima Plishtim. When you take our soul, your soul is going to die with our soul, and that's going to be the end of your nation. And I believe in many ways this is a warning call to the United States in many ways, that there's never been a nation that has been more benevolent and more kind to the Jewish people on the map of world history than the United States of America. We've never had it this good. But, let's face it, we're seeing it start to shake a little bit. We're seeing certain elements start to, the foundation starting to shake a little bit. Happens to be an election going on here in Ohio. I don't know if you've seen my social media posts, but you can't mention it now because there's an official Partners Cleveland program. We're a 501c3. We can't make political endorsements, but Pinchas Landers, the private citizen, can. So feel free to go to my Facebook page. But it's starting to shake a little bit. And as we said recently in the Rabbi's podcast, that's a wake-up call for us. It's a wake-up call. It's a wake-up call that if these elements are in the world today, if these elements are in the government, if they have sway in the government, if they are starting to rise and gain number, then that's saying, the Almighty is saying to us, Jews, wake up! Get the message! Look at history! Look at what's happened before! I expect something from you. That's why this is happening. So yes, of course, we got to vote. We got to try and get the right people into office. But if this is happening, it's something in the Jewish people. We have to look at ourselves and say, what can we be doing better? How can we as a people unite? How can we do things different? How can we make this world a better place? How can we do what we say in the Aleinu prayer, L'saken olam l'malchus shakai, that our role as a Jewish nation on this planet is tikkun olam, but not just heal the world, not just social action, tikkun olam for the sake of the Almighty, to bring God's presence into the world. And that's what we really have to think about at these times when we remember all those amazing holy souls throughout all of Jewish history that have given up their lives, all Kiddush Hashem, sanctifying the name of God, and that with that fateful idea and theme that was set forward by Shimshon HaGibor, by the great Samson of Talmus Nafshi Ima Plishtim. How you can kill me, but I'm going to take you with us, and the Jewish people are going to live on. That's Shimshon. And that brings us to the last two of our Shoftim, the last two of our judges. And one is the aforementioned Eli Cohen. So after Samson dies or is killed or dies or whatever you call that, the next leader is the high priest Eli, who we mentioned before. Now, Eli is a very tragic character because he in and of himself is a great man. And I mean, he's the high priest of Israel. He's the spiritual leader of the Jewish people, and we're going to see the provincial leader as the shofet. But unfortunately, his sons Hophni and Pinchas are not so great. We see they're going to take advantage of certain things given to the priesthood, and whereas the high priesthood or the priesthood in general is something that is dynastical in the Jewish people, still the leadership roles have to be meritocracy, and Eli Cohen is going to realize pretty quickly that his sons are not fitting to take over as the high priest. He's going to be told as such by the prophet, and he's going to see that Hophni and Pinchas are not going to be his successor as the high priest, and that it's going to go back to a different family within the kahuna, within the priesthood. Now, we see an amazing thing happen. A very similar story. The lives of Shimshon, of Samson, and Samuel the prophet mirror each other in many ways. First of all, Samuel's parents were also, or at least his mother was barren. His mother was none other than Hannah, the famous Hannah, and her husband Elkanah had another wife, Penina. Penina had children. Hannah didn't have children. Hannah goes to the Mishkan to pray, and when she's there, Eli Cohen sees her praying and initially doesn't know what she's doing, and then figures it out and says, your prayer is going to be answered. You're going to have children, and the child that is born is none other than Samuel the prophet. Realizing to a certain extent that this is a miracle baby, there's two decisions made on the part, again, directed by Eli, the high priest, but that are put into place by Hannah and Elkanah. And that is that, number one, Samuel also becomes an eternal Nazarite, becomes a Samsonite Nazarite, like Samson was. And beyond that, we see that Hannah and Elkanah dedicate their son to the Mishkan. Samuel is a Kohen also, and basically the book of Samuel tells us, because now we've transitioned into the book of Samuel, the story of Eli is where the book of Samuel begins, and that Samuel, once he is weaned, is left at the Mishkan to be raised by Eli, to be raised in the ways of Eli, and we're going to see that he is going to be the progenitor of Eli, because when Eli's children can't take over either in leadership or as the high priest, we're going to see that Samuel definitely takes over in the leadership role and will lead the Jewish people to greatness. Now, there's one fateful day during this time period where we see things come to a head once again with the Philistines. They've regained a certain amount of strength after their run-in with Samson, and they once again torment the Jewish people. And at this point, the sons of Eli, Hophni and Pinchas, have this idea that, okay, we're going to go to battle with the Philistines, and maybe we're on the same level that the Jews were on when they originally conquered the land of Israel. Now, if you remember way back to Joshua, when Joshua conquered the city of Jericho, what was the battle plan? The battle plan was to take the great ark, the Aron HaKodesh, the great lost ark, or at that point it was found, right? The great ark into battle, walk on the city once a day, 7 times last day, walls fall down, battle's over, right? That was the great battle plan. Hophni and Pinchas think they're on the level of Joshua and make a mistake, but they say, let's take the Ark of the Covenant into battle with the Philistines. And not only are they tragically wrong, but the ark is captured by the Philistines. Hophni and Pinchas are killed in battle. And when message gets back to Eli about what happened, that his sons were killed, that the Ark of the Covenant was captured by the Philistines, the prophet tells us that he fell off his chair and died. Fell off his chair, hit his head, and died. A very tragic day that we see Eli, his sons died probably the same day. The ark is captured. And this is the leadership void that Samuel the prophet comes into. Okay? But it's going to be a low point, and we're going to see Samuel is going to raise the Jewish people up to the highest of heights. And what happens is, as the ark stays with the Philistines, after a few months, 7 months in total, realize that this is not such a good idea. What happens is they bring it into a certain place, and their idol of Dagon that we mentioned before flips over. They put it back up. The next morning they come back, the idol's flipped over again. And then they start to get physical afflictions. Most notable is the prophet tells them they get hemorrhoids. And this is well before the time of preparation H. So, hemorrhoids can be pretty painful if you don't have an over-the-counter or prescription medication to take care of it. And eventually they realize, get rid of this Ark of the Covenant. This is not bringing us anything we want. And they send it back to the Jewish people. Initially, the Ark goes to the town of Beit Shemesh, which is now a very popular suburb of Jerusalem. But we see that while the Ark is in Beit Shemesh, the people of Beit Shemesh, the Jews of Beit Shemesh, don't treat it properly. And for anyone who is an Indiana Jones fan, we know what happens when you don't treat the Ark of the Covenant properly, right? You burn down into ashes, and that's loosely taken for what happens to the people in Beit Shemesh, right? The number of them died, tens of thousands of them died because they try to look in the Ark, like the guy in the Indiana Jones movie. Again, that story is coming straight from the prophet over there, and at least Indiana looked away. I was very happy. I was very worried he was going to look, but he looked away, so he was okay. But that's what happens. And they say, okay, no good for us either. We're not fitting for this, and they end up sending it to a town a little bit closer to Jerusalem by the name of Kiryas Yearim. Now, Kiryas Yearim has a very interesting Cleveland connection. We know exactly where that town is today. That town is just outside Jerusalem. You take the road on the way to Tel Aviv, and it's shortly after you leave Jerusalem. It's on towards the left, right outside Jerusalem, considered a Jerusalem suburb today. Town's called Kiryas Yearim, but it has another name, and the other name it has is called Telz Stone. Now, why is it called Telz Stone? It's called Telz Stone because back in the 70s, there was a great Rosh Yeshiva by the name of Rav Mordechai Gifter, Zecher Tzadik Livracha. And Mordechai Gifter was was an heir to the great Telzer dynasty here in Cleveland. That's the name of the great yeshiva here in Cleveland. And he had a dream of building a branch of Telz in Israel. So he moved to Israel, and he opens up a branch of the Telz yeshiva in Kiryas Yearim. Who was his sponsor? Who was the philanthropist who sponsored him? None other than Irving Stone, the founder of American Greetings. We always talk about American Greetings being a great philanthropic family here in Cleveland. They're great supporters of Partners in Torah, of Partners Cleveland. Now it's the Weiss family is the grandchildren of Irving Stone. And so Irving Stone is the one who supports Rabbi Gifter's project. So therefore it becomes named, and then after he passed away, his children, but it becomes named Telz after the great yeshiva and Stone after the Stone family, hence the name Telz Stone, which is called until this day. Now, ultimately what happens is Rabbi Gifter's father-in-law passes away. He's called back here to Cleveland to lead the mothership yeshiva. He wasn't sure what to do. He ends up coming back, and he was the head of the Telz yeshiva here in Cleveland until he got sick, unfortunately, in the 90s, and then ultimately passed away. But that's a little connection between this city we're talking about now, Kiryas Yearim, which is called in the book of Samuel, but what is in modern days called Telz Stone because of none other than the city of Cleveland. Now, the people of Kiryas Yearim, which means they're known for being very pious people, and they deal with the Ark properly. And the Ark is there for a total of 20 years, and nothing happens because they deal with it with a proper respect. And we're going to see that it stays there until King David becomes king and brings the Ark to Jerusalem, where it will stay for the 36 years of King David's reign. And then eventually will be there ready for Solomon to build the temple, which he'll do in his reign. Now, it's interesting to point out that during this time period, we have the Ark of the Covenant that once it's taken out by Pinchas and by Eli's sons, by Pinchas and Hophni, we see that it never returns to the Mishkan. Strange for me. I don't have a good answer for this. But basically, for the next, I believe, 57 years, the Mishkan, the portable temple, which is stationary at this point, but the precursor to the actual temple, and the Ark of the Covenant are not together. Because at this time period, so what happens is, just to rewind a little bit, at the beginning of this war with the Philistines, when the Philistines capture the Ark of the Covenant, they destroy the Mishkan, which was in Shiloh. Now, what does Shmuel do? Samuel the prophet, what does he do? He rebuilds in a city called Nov, and it's there for 13 years. Now, why he built in Nov as opposed to Shiloh, not so clear, but he builds it in the city of Nov, which was a city of all priests. We're going to see that city gets into trouble when King Saul is ruling. We'll talk about that next week. And King Saul wipes out the whole city and destroys the Mishkan for next week. And then at that point, it is moved to the city of Gibon, where it is for 44 years until the temple is built and it is dismantled. But it's strange that here we have a time period of 57 years where the Mishkan is functioning in different places, but without an Ark of the Covenant. Which, to be fair, while the Ark of the Covenant is a vital part of the building of the Mishkan, it's talked about in the Torah already as we described the building of the Mishkan, it's not part of the actual service. In other words, it's never actually used in any part of the service. It's there in the Holy of Holies, but it's never actually used in any part of the service. So they could still perform the full service for these 57 years while the Ark and the Mishkan are separated, but it's just a little bit of an interesting phenomenon that I don't have a good answer to that, because it would seem to me that, okay, why doesn't Samuel the prophet bring the ark back to Nov and then to Gibon? Why didn't he bring them, unite them? And I've never found a good answer. So if anyone out there who's watching has a good answer, by all means, I'd love to hear it. But that's what happens. So just to wrap up Samuel, because we're already over time here, this is the beginning of his reign, having to deal with the Philistines, having to deal with the war, having to deal with the Mishkan being destroyed and needing to rebuild it, having to deal with the Ark of the Covenant being separated from the Mishkan. And this is the void he comes into, the void of leadership he comes into. Now, when he becomes a leader, he's 42 years old. He was left by his parents at the Mishkan. Again, I don't know if he went home for vacations. I don't know if he went home for the holidays. We don't talk about that. But for 40 years, he's been under the tutelage, under been the right-hand man, if you will, of Eli Cohen. Now he's the leader of the Jewish people. And he starts to deal with all these issues. He helps to put down the police team. He rebuilds the Mishkan. And most significantly is he unites the Jewish people. Now, during this time period, we mentioned that all 12 of the tribes were loosely aligned, kind of functioned together a little bit. The court system functioned together. Obviously, you just had one Mishkan, but you could also, during many of these times, have private altars, as we talked about. Samuel feels it in the air, so to speak, that it's time to reunite the Jewish people and get them ready for the concept that we were talking about before, the concept of the king, the concept of Mashiach, which we'll talk about a little bit more next week. And so he starts to work to unite the Jewish people. And for the next 10 years, he basically spends all of his time traveling throughout the whole land of Israel, visiting the different tribes, working to bring the tribes together, working on national reform in a spiritual sense, working on educational reform. And he literally exhausts his body working to this end of bringing the Jewish people together. But ultimately, he will succeed in uniting the Jewish people and paving the way for a king in Israel. Now, Samuel thought that his two sons, again, very similar to his Rebbe, Eli, he thought that his two sons, Yoel and Aviah, were at least one of the two of them would take over for him. But we're going to see that they're also not fitting to take over for him. So basically, he sees that at the end of his life, the Jewish people come to him and ask for a king. And we'll talk about that issue more next week when we start the idea of the kingship of Israel. But just to wrap up tonight, we'll point out that Samuel dies when he's 52 years old. Totally just, body worn out of having been given to the Jewish people. And in Jewish really psyche / philosophy / halacha, from that point forward, that is considered the demarcation of living a full life and not living a full life. Now, again, we think nowadays 52, God forbid anyone would pass away at 52, that's tremendously young because of our advancements in medicine and whatnot. But that's considered, at least in halacha, that anyone who, God forbid, dies at 52 or younger is considered to die young. And anyone who makes it to 53 or older, okay, you don't die old, but it's not considered dying young. What are the practical differences? The practical difference when this comes up in Jewish law is with naming children. That there's a concept when we name for somebody that we don't want to name for someone who lived a tragic life. And included in that is somebody who dies young. So Talmud says, and brought down more in rabbinical literature, that anyone who lives 52 years or less, if the family is to name for that person, they need to add a name. They need to change the name somehow to make it not the same name because that person died young. We had this practically with my mother-in-law, Shalom, who passed away at 58. We were 6 years over, and I remember discussing it with my Rebbe when our Zahava was born, whose name for her, if we needed to add a name or not add a name. And this is what we were told, that she didn't, she made it to 58. She made it past 52. But this becomes the demarcation in the Jewish psyche, as he made it like over the hill, if you will, is not 40, it's 52 in Jewish law. Now, one last thing on Samuel before we wrap up is Samuel is a very prolific writer of the Tanakh. When we talk about the Jewish Bible, that there is a total of about 2.5 books that Samuel wrote. He wrote the book of Shoftim, which we finished tonight. He wrote the book of Ruth, the Megillah of Ruth, which we covered tonight. And he wrote the first half of the book of Samuel until he dies. Obviously, he didn't write the part after he died. The second part is written by Gad the prophet, Gad Hanavi. That's G-A-D, not G-O-D, named for the tribe of Gad. And he's the one who writes the rest of the book of Samuel. And by the way, just so we're clear, that in a Jewish sense, there was only one book of Samuel, right? Even though we call it, Samuel A, Samuel B, Samuel 1, Samuel 2, that is something that's given to us quite later, either the time of Septuagint or the time of the Christians, and we use it because it's user-friendly, but in a Jewish sense, there's only one book of Samuel. So Samuel 1 and Samuel 2 is just convenient. So Samuel wrote the first part before he passes away, and the second part is written by the book of Gad, and that will cover the lives of King Saul and King David, which we'll pick up with, God willing, next week. But just to wrap up, once again, on Sunday, we have our program, Torah Anyone, with some phenomenal Jewish speakers, Charlie Harari, Ben-Sam Klatsko, Dr. David Lieberman, Harry Rothenberg, Rabbi Tannenbaum, Elisa Beulah, and Neely Cousins, Rebbetzin Heller, a bunch of wonderful, wonderful speakers, Rebbetzin Young, Rice Wolf, and tune in on Sunday beginning at 10 a.m. all day long while you're talking about and thinking about the tragedies of Jewish history. Let's get some inspiration as Jews as to where we look for in the destiny of the Jewish people. I'll hang around for questions as long as you got them, but for anyone who's heading out, I thank you for coming. Hopefully we'll see you on Sunday, and I look forward to continue next week with the life and times of King Saul and King David. Okay, so to questions, first of all, in our chat box here. Yeah, thanks, Mikhail. I appreciate that. Was Samuel from the tribe of Levi? Yes, Samuel's from the tribe of Levi. Samuel was a Kohen, actually. Do eternal Nazarites have the status of Kohen? No. They're similar to a Kohen in their practices, but that does not elevate them to being a Kohen. Do you think there's an argument that there were capos whose intention was more altruistic for the benefit of the Jewish people, like Samson, versus just for their personal benefit? I would like to think so, right? The capos were the Jewish Nazi appointees in the camps and in the ghettos who had certain roles for the Nazis. Again, just a terrible atrocity, one of the many terrible atrocities of the Nazis. And Jeremy was asking, do you think maybe that some of them had noble goals in mind? Maybe not. I don't know. There's some terrible stories with them, but I would hope so. And then someone asked me a private question about the Plain Dealer. I don't read the Plain Dealer. I don't waste my time on that. Yeah. Okay. So any other questions? Feel free to. Sorry, capo. Capo, not capo. Capo is the thing on your guitar. Capo was the Jewish Nazi soldiers or Jewish Nazi town leaders or whatever we call them. Okay. Any last questions before we wrap it up?
What time do you speak on Sunday?
What time do I speak? The actual schedule will be released shortly, so we'll know who speaks at what time. We have to wait to organize a few things, but hopefully as of tomorrow or at the latest Thursday, the actual schedule will be out for Sunday. And don't worry, because if you miss any of them, we're going to have them all posted on that link afterwards. So if you miss someone based on the time they're speaking, don't worry, you can catch them afterwards at TorahAnyone.com. Okay, everyone have a wonderful evening, and I look forward to seeing you Sunday, and if not before, and then of course next Tuesday. Be well.
Thank you.
Thank you.